Welcome to Hye Roots, Descendants of Ararat. I am George Ajayan, your host for this episode of the first series devoted to Armenian genealogy. With each new episode of Hye Roots, we will explore different resources that will aid those wishing to learn more about their Armenian family history. Today, I am joined by Greg Klein. Greg reached out to me a couple of months ago searching for the manifest of the ship his grandmother had sailed to the U.S. on. The story he told was tragic, yet important, and so we decided to share it with you as well. Welcome, Greg.
Oh, thank you. Welcome.
Maybe you can start by just telling us a little bit about your childhood memories of your grandmother, what you think of when you think of her, and then maybe a little bit about the life what you knew about her life.
Okay, I'll try my best. My grandmother was Lillian Arisian Ogasian. She was born in a town, called Egan. Her parents were Miriam Yandian and Murgadich Arisian. Her brother Carl was born 4 years later in June of 1910. And what my grandma remembers from growing up in her life, she remembered back to about when she was about 5, how everyone lived. They all lived in a big barn-like structure, sharing it with other people, and worked in the fields. And whoever was able to work, worked, even the kids. I always identified much more with the Armenian side because of my grandma. She was basically the centerpiece of our family. I'm half German and half Armenian, so to put a little light on the matter, I always say I don't know whether I'm coming or going, because half of me was doing the annihilating and the other half was getting annihilated. But anyway, she was always there for me and everyone else in the family. She loved and supported everybody and just cared for everyone. Then as I grew older, got mature, and I wanted to learn more about our Armenian culture and more about Grandma's life. I had no idea, because she never talked about it. She wanted to shield us and protect us from the pain she went through, both in Turkey and the United States. But as I got married and had a son, I read the book, The Black Dog of Fate. This gave me a clue of what went on. So then, being a salesman, I started to ask her about her past. She responded that you don't want to know. It's horrible. And then she cited one example of when she was in a deportation march. She said she saw the Turks pry the eyes out of Armenian men as torture, as a 9-year-old kid. Nothing more was said. Being the salesman I am, I took another approach. I encouraged my mom and auntie, and my aunt is still alive today. She turns 99 next month. I talk to her every other week, to try and talk to her about her life story. I kept pressing my mom. Nothing. I heard nothing. And then Granny passes away in 2001, and my mom passes away in 2013. And as I'm going through her stuff in the nightstand in the extra bedroom, I open the drawer and find 7 pages of notes. 7 pages of handwritten notes, which allowed me to start to put a story together. The Turks come in and they kick all the Armenians out of their homes and put them on a march, going through the desert, over mountains. She watched people fall off a trail to their death. She watched the men get tortured and killed. So they got real sick, and she got so sick with diarrhea and diphtheria that somehow Miriam was able to put the kids with what she said was an Arab family somewhere. And this happened 2 different times. And the second one was a really nice Arab family. And they nursed both her and Carl back to health, and stayed there for a while. Her mother was able to come back because she had escaped the march and was living in caves with other Armenian families. So she took them back to the caves to show them, and then asked them if they would like to stay with her there, and they said no, they wanted to go back to the Arab family. So they did. And then when she said goodbye, that was the last time she saw her mom. She walked over a hill with some other Armenian mothers, and they heard gunshots, and so she just assumed that she walked into an ambush. She carried the genocide and the horrific crime her father made in Providence, Rhode Island, almost her entire life. What a burden to carry.
This is all an excellent starting place to look into a little bit more of the history and the documents behind the history, to validate some of the oral tradition that we're talking about, and specifically to document Shushan or Lillian's travel to the United States, her timeline, the chronology that you have. So let's take a look inside the vault. As I have mentioned in previous episodes, Mark Arslan's Armenian Immigration Project website is a great place to start with this type of research question. Greg had attached a link to the Armenian Immigration Project abstract of the ship manifest for Mugadich Irazian arriving in the United States on September 7, 1920. But there are a number of issues with this record representing our Mugadich. This Mugadic was traveling with his mother Miriam and wife Anna. They were joining Mugadic's father Sahag in Providence, Rhode Island. The declaration of intention for Sahag lists a son, Michael, born in 1899, that must be this Mugadic. Note that it also indicates that Sahag was from the village of Yarasar in the Sivas province. Greg's grandmother Shushan was born March 25, 1906, according to her petition for naturalization. Thus, we can be pretty confident that this Mugadic born in 1899 could not be the father of Shushan, born in 1906, as he would have only been 7 years old. There are other reasons as well. I was able to track this Mugadic, his wife Anna, and their children through successive United States censuses from 1930 to 1950, something I presumably could not do with Shushan's father, who was on the run from the law. In the Armenian Immigration Project database, the records pertaining to Shushan's brother, Katakin, or Karl, were attached to this Mugadic as son and father, but this is not the case. When doing genealogical research, it is important that all of the information available be validated to make sure you have the correct person. Consistency in age, children's names, wife's name, residence, etc. are all critical to this process. Shushan's certificate of arrival stated she entered the United States on December 15, 1920. Unfortunately, it did not list the name of the ship. Using some creative search techniques, I was able to locate Mugadic's arrival with his daughter Shushan and second wife Zarawi on the SS Hefron sailing from Patras on November 21, 1920, and arriving in New York on December 16, 1920. One of the things we learned from the manifest is that Margadich had been in the United States previously from 1911 to 1920. In actuality, Margadich had arrived on April 28, 1912. His wife Miriam was the closest relative left behind, and he was joining an uncle, Stepan, in Milford, Massachusetts. The ship manifest for Sahag indicates he was also joining an uncle, Stepan, in Milford, Massachusetts at the same address, 40 Central Street. Sahag was shown to still be living at this address in 1915, but I have found no record for a Stepan Ayrasyan. Additionally, Margadich does not appear in the city directories for Milford during those years. In 1911, another Ayrasyan, Krikord, again joined Stepan in Milford, stating he was also his uncle. Could it be that Sahag, Margadich, and Krikord were brothers? The 1910 census and 1911 city directory from Milford does list one Stepan at the address specified, but his surname was Dadarian. It appears to have been a boarding house, so possibly there was another Stepan living there that was not listed in the census, but it seems more likely that this Stepan Dadarian was the uncle in question. Now let's share what we have found with Greg. Welcome back, Greg. There is a lot to unpack here, and the tragedy that unfolded obviously complicates the research. Let's try to build the information we have found in a chronological order. 3 Ayrasyan brothers or close cousins come to the United States. Sahag in 1910, Krikord in 1911, and Margadich in 1912. After the end of World War I, Krikord places ads in the Hye newspaper looking for family members. In June 8, 1919 issue of the Hye Daily, there is a notice listing the names of those from Yarosar that have been liberated. The notice is posted by Sahag Dosturian, a soldier for the Armenian Legion in Adana. During World War I, Armenians from Musaler in the diaspora joined the French army and ultimately formed what we refer to as the Armenian Legion. They fought on the Palestinian front and after the war remained in Gilgit as a peacekeeping force. Many of the soldiers, as you would expect, made every attempt to locate survivors from their own families. The Ayrasyans listed in the ad include your grandmother, Shushan. Within a year of this notice, Margadich started the process of becoming a United States citizen. Sometime after July 8, 1920, the date of this declaration of intention, he would have left the United States to get to Shushan, and by December, he had returned to the United States, not only with her, but also his new wife, Zadawi Danelian. As you know, they would have 2 children, a daughter, Azadawi, who you named Rose, who was born in 1921, and a son, Nishan, who was born in 1922. 2 months after Nishan's birth, Margadich murdered Katrina Farishian. By 1925, Zadawi had remarried Simon Dudigian under the premise Margadich had died. In the 1930 census, we find Margadich living in Messina, New York under the assumed name Nicola Damadan. Newspaper articles in the early 1940s detail his capture, extradition, trial, and conviction for the murder. He was initially found guilty of first-degree murder, which carried a sentence of life in prison. But to avoid appeal, the judge reduced the charge to second-degree murder, which carried a 22-year term. Less than 3 years later, Margadich would commit suicide while in prison. And as you know, much of this is related to the illness he suffered, which probably still impacted him even at that point in life, even though it was assumed that he was cured. Most likely that was not the case based on the actions that happened in the intervening years and also what was happening there. For our purposes here, though, the death certificate lists his father as Nishan Ayrazian. It would be useful to compare this to the death certificates for Krikord and Sahag to see if their father is also stated to be named Nishan. And that way we would confirm, one way or another, if they were cousins or siblings. In reviewing the Ottoman population registers for Yarosar, which is the village that your family came from, the Irasian household was identifiable. One of those listed was an infant named Nishan. This dates from 1840. While not conclusive, it is still highly probable that this Nishan would be the father of Mugadich. Regardless, we can say for sure that you are descended from Abram Irasian, who would have likely been born sometime around 1740 to 1750, and that is quite a long time ago to trace your Armenian family roots. I know when you started, you were trying to hope to learn more about the timeline and specifically the ship manifest of your grandmother coming to the United States, which we did find. Also a little bit more about her family, which we were able to locate as well, and to trace back a significant period of time based on the fact that they came from a village with very good documentation and where the family name had been in use for multiple generations dating back well over 100 years, which is not very common, truthfully, in the Armenian context. Most family surnames are of recent origin and changed relatively frequently from generation to generation. So from this perspective, you are very fortunate.
Going back just a touch, before I met you, and I was dealing with information that had been given to me through various sources. I'm a salesman. I'm not Mr. Technological to be able to look things up as you are. And the amazing thing is it was a big coincidence. We found out through you that there were two Murgadiches around the same time, and I had based a lot of the story around the wrong Murgadich, and they both happened to land in December of 1920 in Ellis Island.
But let me move on to another aspect of the story. There was one part of the oral tradition passed down by Shushan, in which you mentioned earlier as well, that was unusual to me and a bit suspect. She had said that the family had moved from Yarasar to Agan or Agan. There are two villages with these names in the region of Arapgir, but it is quite a distance from Yarasar, and it is unclear why they would have moved there with no apparent family from that region. In 1912, when Mugadich arrived in the United States, he stated his wife Miriam was still living in Sivas, not Kharpet or Arapgir or Agan. And the 1919 list of those from Yarasar that had been liberated would also seem to imply that the family had been with their fellow villagers during the genocide. How do we reconcile these pieces of information? Well, there was a village close to Yarasar with a significant Armenian population, the village of Hacht. There is a book by Dutad Datardian about this village that mentions the various ways Armenians pronounce the name of the village. Acht and Alt may have sounded like Aran to Shushan's children. It seems likely in the retelling of the story, the village name was misinterpreted. Datardian's book also includes Armenian Genocide survivor testimony. Let me read you a passage that will show the commonality with what we know of Shushan's experiences during the genocide. I'm just going to read this passage. They exiled us to Deir Zor, where we worked as slaves for the Arabs from the winter of 1915 until the fall of 1918. When the liberating British armies occupied the territory we were in, they sent horse carriages, gathered us survivors from the homes of Arabs, and sent us to Aleppo. In Aleppo, we were happy to see those brave Halsetsis from America who had volunteered for the Armenian Legion. The remnants of the Halsetsis who had miraculously survived gathered in Aleppo from Hama, Homs, Salemia. Our legionnaire brothers encouraged us, gave us hope, and helped us financially and morally. With endless love and devotion, we had a desire to live again. Our brothers in arms gave us the addresses of our husbands, brothers, and relatives living in America. And of course, our loved ones were not late in helping us. We Halchetsis who had gathered in Aleppo, went to the city of Adana in Cilicia, which had been liberated by the Allies. Greetings to Armenian soil and God. We were liberated, even though only 5% of us survived. So what we see here is that the story lines up exactly with the testimony that you have of Shushan and the newspaper article saying that she was one of those liberated living in Adana at that time on the eve of your great-grandfather traveling back to find her. I believe these hints and clues and the commonality of the name of the village leads me to believe that this is probably what was being communicated by Shushan when she was talking to her daughters. Thank you so much for joining us today, Greg, and I hope you found this useful in your own Armenian family history research. If you have a question for a future episode, please send it to hyroots@heidenik.com.